After that claim, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Not the polite kind, not the thoughtful kind. It was the kind of silence that made people shift in their seats without moving, that pressed against the chest and made breathing feel louder than it should have been. Kresge Centennial Hall had been built for applause, for confidence, for certainty. Its marble floors reflected chandeliers that had watched generations of achievement walk proudly beneath them. The walls were lined with portraits of men who had never been questioned while they were alive, men who had spoken and been believed. Now, none of that mattered. No one laughed, no one whispered, no one dared to look at the person next to them. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on the same point in space. A boy, 10 years old, black, too small for the chair he stood beside, shoulders tense, hands still at his sides as if he were afraid that even breathing might make things worse. Preston Davis did not look like a disruptor of systems. He looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong room and realized too late that leaving would only draw more attention. Across the hall, parents in tailored suits sat frozen, their expressions caught between confusion and offense. Professors who had spent decades speaking without interruption stared forward, unsure whether what they had just heard was real or an insult. A few students blinked rapidly, as if waiting for someone older and louder to explain what had gone wrong. No one did. The words still hung in the air, refusing to settle. Dr. Caldwell is right, and I can prove it. It was not the confidence that unsettled them. It was the certainty, the absence of apology, the way the sentence had landed without asking permission. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a throat cleared and immediately fell silent again. Someone else let out a nervous breath, then stopped, realizing how loud it sounded. A man in the front row reached instinctively for his phone, then thought better of it, lowering his hand as if caught doing something inappropriate. This was not how moments like this were supposed to unfold. If a child spoke out of turn, the room usually corrected him. If someone crossed a line, there was laughter to soften it, or authority to push it back into place. There were scripts for discomfort, unwritten rules everyone understood, but no one had prepared for this. The claim had not come with bravado. There was no challenge in Preston's voice, no plea either. He had not raised his hand. He had not waited to be invited. He had simply stated something that could not be unheard. A few people glanced instinctively toward the judge's table, searching for direction. Others stared straight ahead, their expressions hardening as a quiet instinct kicked in. Defend the order, protect the hierarchy, restore balance, because something felt wrong. Not mathematically, socially. This was not the right kind of person to say a thing like that. Not the right age. Not the right background. Not the right face. An invisible boundary had been crossed, and everyone in the room felt it at the same time. The unspoken line between who was allowed to question and who was expected to listen had shifted, just enough to make the ground feel unstable. Preston could feel it too. He felt the weight of their attention like heat on his skin. He could sense the resistance, the quiet tightening of 100 minds pulling back at once, and his heart was pounding now. But he did not move. He did not look away. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman's lips trembled as if she wanted to say his name, though no one yet knew it. Somewhere else, a man frowned, already deciding that this moment would need to be corrected, contained, explained away. Still, no one spoke. The silence stretched, growing heavier with every second it was allowed to exist. And in that silence, something else became clear. This was no longer about a competition, no longer about a problem on a board, no longer even about whether the claim was true. It was about what would happen next, because whatever system had been built to prevent moments like this had failed, and everyone in the room knew it. They did not yet know who Preston Davis was. They did not yet know who Dr. Caldwell was. But they knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something had just challenged them, and nothing felt the same anymore. Dr. Richard Caldwell had spent his entire adult life in rooms like this, rooms where people waited for him to speak, rooms where silence followed his words, not because anyone was afraid, but because disagreement felt unnecessary. At 64, Caldwell moved through Northwestern University the way a permanent fixture does. Not hurried, not cautious. The building bent around him. Administrators deferred. Junior faculty lowered their voices when he passed. Students spoke his name with the careful tone reserved for people who could shape futures with a sentence. He was a full professor of mathematics. Award plaques lined his office walls. Endowed chairs bore his name, and in the center of his legacy sat the idea that had defined him for more than 3 decades. The Caldwell conjecture, an elegant, controversial theory about limits in network optimization, a lower boundary no system could cross, no matter how clever the method. Brilliant, provocative, unproven, and that was the part Caldwell rarely said out loud. He believed in systems, not just mathematical ones, but human ones. He trusted hierarchies, trusted processes, trusted that time, credentials, and institutions filtered out what did not belong. The academic world, in his mind, was a river with a natural current. Strong ideas floated to the surface, weak ones sank, and people who were not meant to be there never made it far enough to matter. That belief shaped everything he did. It shaped the way he ran his classes, the way he chose his graduate students, the way he supervised competitions like the Illinois Young. Mathematicians open. Caldwell liked control, not loudly, not cruelly. Quiet control was far more effective. He insisted on being present at registration, reviewed qualifier lists personally, approved judging panels himself. When someone suggested this level of involvement was unnecessary for a scholar of his stature, he smiled and said excellence required attention. What he never said was that attention allowed him to maintain order. He noticed patterns others ignored. Which schools produced serious students? Which backgrounds produced distractions? Which names appeared too often and which never did? In 40 years of teaching, he had never supervised a black doctoral candidate. Not because he refused them, he would say. They simply never made it far enough. The system decided, or so he believed. That morning, as Caldwell adjusted his cufflinks in the mirrored wall of the faculty lounge, he felt calm, even satisfied. Whatever disruption had occurred earlier, it was manageable. Statements could be clarified, expectations reset, children reminded of their place. The system would correct itself. Miles away, on the south side of Chicago, the system looked very different. Preston Davis sat at a small kitchen table with one wobbly leg, his feet dangling because the chair was too high. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of an old refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic drifting through cracked windows. Ruby Davis stood at the stove, her movements slow but practiced. 71 years old, retired from the Postal Service, raising her grandson on a fixed income and stubborn faith. She glanced over her shoulder. "You eat anything at school today, baby?" Preston nodded without looking up. He was writing in a battered notebook, pages soft from use, margins filled with symbols that had no place in a 5th grade classroom. "Yes, ma'am." "Peanut butter sandwich." "You finished your homeworks?" "Yes, Mom." Ruby smiled. That was as much checking as she could do. She had never learned the language her grandson spoke on those pages, never understood how numbers could pile into meaning, but she recognized focus. She recognized hunger that had nothing to do with food. Preston had no parents to advocate for him, no tutors, no advanced placement programs waiting to be unlocked. What he had was a public library 3 bus stops away, and librarians who stopped asking why a child wanted graduate-level math books. That was where he learned about Caldwell, about Morrison, about arguments that stretched longer than his own lifetime. To Preston, the idea that grown adults could argue for decades without resolving something felt strange, wasteful, almost sad. So he worked. He worked because answers mattered, because truth felt cleaner than ego, because numbers did not care where you came from. Back at Northwestern, a voice cut through Caldwell's certainty. Patricia Whitmore stood in the doorway of the faculty lounge, a folder tucked under her arm. 52, University of Chicago. Known for precision, not drama. "Richard," she said quietly, "we need to talk about the boy." Caldwell sighed, already annoyed. He knew which boy. "This is being blown out of proportion, Patricia. Children say things." She did not smile. He qualified with the highest score in the region. Caldwell waved a hand. "Scores are not context. I reviewed his scratch work." She continued, "Not the test answers, the way he thinks. It is not imitation. It is not memorization." She paused, choosing her words carefully. It is original. For the first time that day, Caldwell felt something flicker. Not fear, irritation mixed with curiosity. He is 10, Patricia. So was Gauss when he corrected his teachers. She replied. Silence stretched between them, thinner than the one in the hall, but no less charged. You are overreacting, Caldwell said finally. The system will sort this out. Whitmore held his gaze. Or the system will expose itself. She turned and left before he could respond. Caldwell stood alone, jaw tight. He told himself she was sentimental, that brilliance required refinement, that children who burned too brightly burned out just as fast. Everything was still under control. Across the city, Preston closed his notebook and slid it carefully into his backpack. Ruby handed him a paper towel and kissed the top of his head. You ready for tomorrow, baby? Preston hesitated, then nodded. I think so. He did not know the rules of the game he was stepping into, did not know how carefully the field had been arranged. He only knew that answers existed and that he was not afraid to look for them. While Richard Caldwell trusted the system to protect him, Preston Davis was about to walk straight into it, and neither of them understood yet how little control either truly had. Registration day did not feel like the beginning of something. It felt like an inspection. Kresge Centennial Hall buzzed with a low, confident energy. Parents spoke in practiced tones about summer programs and private coaches. Students compared schools, scores, plans. Jackets were pressed, shoes polished. Everything about the room suggested preparation and belonging. Preston Davis stood near the entrance, his backpack hanging low on his shoulders, fingers curled tightly around one strap. The room was too bright, too loud, too sure of itself. Ruby Davis stayed a few steps behind him, her hand hovering near his back without touching. She had learned that sometimes protection meant letting go just enough. Preston needed to walk forward on his own. At the center of the registration area, Dr. Richard Caldwell presided over the table. He was not scheduled to be there. Everyone knew that. Professors of his rank rarely handled logistics. But Caldwell sat upright behind the long table, glasses low on his nose, scanning forms as if reviewing arguments instead of names. When Preston stepped forward, the conversation around them did not stop immediately. It faded slowly, curiosity rippling outward as people noticed the size difference first. Caldwell looked up. His eyes paused for a half-second longer than necessary. Yes, he said. Preston swallowed. I am here to register. My name is Preston Davis. Caldwell glanced at the form, then back at the boy. How old are you, son 10, sir? A few heads turned. Someone laughed softly, thinking it was a joke. Caldwell leaned back in his chair. This competition is for serious students. High school students. I qualified, sir. Preston said it evenly. I had the highest score in my region. The smile that crossed Caldwell's face did not reach his eyes. Scores are numbers, he replied. Context matters more. Preston felt heat creep up his neck. He could feel the room paying attention now. Ruby stiffened behind him. Caldwell pushed the form back across the table without signing it. I think you may be in the wrong place, he said. There are programs better suited for children. Outreach programs. Something more appropriate to what Preston asked before he could stop himself. The air shifted. Caldwell's gaze sharpened. To your level of preparation, a few people chuckled, not cruelly, casually, as if the conclusion were obvious. Preston looked down. His notebook had slipped halfway out of his backpack when he moved. Before he could pull it back, Caldwell reached forward and picked it up. What is this? Caldwell asked, flipping it open. My notes, sir. Notes, Caldwell echoed, scanning the pages. His brow furrowed, not in understanding but irritation. He turned the notebook so the nearest parents could see. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, voice rising just enough to carry. We have a very imaginative young man here. More laughter now. Louder. This child believes he is working on the Caldwell-Morrison debate. The room reacted the way crowds do when given permission. Smiles widened. Heads shook. Someone whispered, unbelievable. Caldwell looked back at Preston. Listen carefully. This is not a place for fantasies. People here have spent their lives studying these problems. Preston's chest tightened. His ears rang. He could feel his heartbeat in his throat. In that moment, two paths opened in front of him. He could say nothing, take his notebook back, step away, leave with his dignity intact and his curiosity unscarred, or he could speak. He thought of the library, of nights on the floor with pages spread around him, of questions that did not care who asked them. Caldwell handed the notebook back. Preston took it with both hands. "I understand, sir," he said quietly. Caldwell nodded, satisfied. The correction had been made. Then Preston lifted his head. "But I am not imagining it." The room froze again, faster this time. "I can solve it," Preston continued. "The Caldwell-Morrison problem. I have been working on it." Silence dropped like a curtain. Someone near the judge's table let out a sharp breath. A parent whispered, "Is this real?" Caldwell stared at him. "You think you can solve a problem that has divided this field for decades?" "Yes, sir." The calm in Preston's voice unsettled more than any arrogance could have. Caldwell laughed once, short and sharp. "This is absurd." Maybe Preston said, "But I believe Dr. Caldwell is right." That landed differently. The laughter faltered, replaced by confusion. "And I can prove it." The words were out now. There was no pulling them back. Preston did not smile, did not posture. He simply stood there, a 10-year-old boy holding a worn notebook, having just stepped across a line no one had invited him to cross. No one believed him. But something irreversible had already happened. The system had been challenged out loud, and it would not forget. For a moment, no one reacted, not because they were thinking, because they were recalibrating. The room had rules. Everyone in it had learned them early and well. Who spoke first? Who spoke last? Who was allowed to be wrong in public, and who could not afford to be wrong at all? Preston Davis had not just spoken out of turn, he had spoken out of position. Caldwell's laughter faded slowly, like a sound that realized too late it no longer belonged. He straightened in his chair, folded his hands together, and studied the boy in front of him with new attention. "You can prove it," he repeated. "Yes, sir." The word "sir" landed wrong this time. It did not sound deferential. It sounded final. Caldwell glanced around the room, aware of the audience now. A correction made privately could be dismissed. A spectacle made publicly had to be handled carefully. "Tell me something," Caldwell said, voice calm, controlled. "Who exactly do you think you are arguing with?" Preston hesitated. His fingers tightened around the notebook. "I am not arguing, sir. I am trying to answer a question." A ripple passed through the crowd. Some frowned. Others leaned forward, suddenly invested. Caldwell smiled again, thinner now. "That question has been asked by people far more qualified than you." "I know," Preston said. "I read their papers." A sharp inhale from somewhere near the back. "You read them?" Caldwell asked. "Yes, sir." "From the public library." The word public carried weight in this room. It always did. Caldwell set his pen down deliberately. "Let me be clear. This competition is not a platform for delusions. It exists to identify potential. And potential requires discipline, humility." Preston nodded slowly. "I agree. Then you should understand why this is inappropriate." Preston looked up at him, really looked at him. "If it is wrong, sir, you can tell me where." That was the moment. Not the claim, not the confidence, the challenge. A quiet one, respectful, but unmistakable. Caldwell felt it like a pinprick under the skin. He could dismiss the boy. He could escort him out. He could end this now. But the room was watching. He tapped the notebook once with his finger. "You are saying you found something everyone else missed?" "Yes, sir." "And you believe it supports my position?" "Yes, sir." Caldwell exhaled through his nose, amused despite himself. "Then you have chosen a very strange way to express admiration." A few laughs broke out, grateful for permission. Preston did not laugh. "I did not say it because I admire you, sir. I said it because it is true." The laughter stopped again. This time, it did not return. Somewhere to the left, Dr. Patricia Whitmore watched closely, her expression unreadable. She had seen arrogance before. She had seen brilliance, too. This felt like neither and a both. Caldwell stood. The movement alone quieted the room completely. He stepped out from behind the table and stopped in front of Preston, towering over him without raising his voice. "Let me give you some advice, son. You do not build a future by embarrassing yourself in rooms you do not yet understand." Preston's throat tightened. For the first time, fear crept into his eyes. Not fear of Caldwell, fear of being wrong. Ruby shifted behind him, ready to intervene, but Preston stayed where he was. "I understand the room, sir," he said softly. "I do not understand why the answer scares it." A murmur moved through the crowd like a low wind. Caldwell stared down at him, his jaw set. "This conversation is over," he He turned away, signaling the end, but the damage was already done. As Preston stepped back toward his grandmother, people parted instinctively, unsure whether to avoid him or get closer. Whispers followed him now. Not laughter, something sharper, something uneasy. Did you hear what he said? He thinks he solved it. He is just a kid. What if he is not? Ruby knelt beside Preston, her voice barely above a whisper. You all right, baby? Preston nodded, though his hands were shaking. Across the room, Caldwell resumed signing forms, his movements precise, practiced. To anyone watching, he looked in control, but inside something had shifted. A 10-year-old boy had spoken a forbidden sentence in a sacred space. No one believed him. That was true, but belief was no longer the point. The line had been crossed, the claim had been made, and somewhere beneath the polished floors and confident smiles, the system had begun to crack. The laughter did not follow Preston out of the hall. It stayed behind, fermenting. By the time he reached the front steps of Kresge Centennial Hall, the sound had already changed shape. What began as amusement hardened into narrative. What started as disbelief sharpened into judgment. Someone had recorded the moment. Not the whole exchange, just enough. A shaky phone video, 30 seconds. A small black boy standing in front of a table of adults. A professor laughing. A claim spoken clearly into a microphone not meant for him. Dr. Caldwell is right, and I can prove it. By that evening, the clip had a title. 10-year-old claims he solved famous math debate. By midnight, it had millions of views. The comments came faster than anyone could track them. Some were soft. Poor kid. He is brave at least. Someone should protect him from this embarrassment. Others were sharper. This is what happens when you let kids think too highly of themselves. Another charity case chasing attention. Delusional. And some were curious in a way that made people uncomfortable. Why did the professor look so angry? That kid did not sound confused. What if he actually knows something Preston did not see most of it? Ruby made sure of that. She turned off the television after the first local news segment replayed the clip with a laugh track she did not recognize but felt in her bones. She closed her laptop when a neighbor knocked to ask if that was her grandson on the internet. Inside the apartment, the walls felt closer than usual. Ruby sat at the kitchen table long after Preston had gone to bed, her hands folded around a cold cup of tea. She had lived long enough to recognize patterns. Attention was rarely kind to people who looked like them. T.J. Davis did not share her patience. You see what they are saying about him, T.J. snapped, pacing the living room. His phone glowed in his hand, screen filled with comments that made his jaw tighten. He is 10 Ruby. 10. They are calling him crazy, calling him stupid. Ruby closed her eyes. They have always done that to boys like him. T.J. stopped pacing. I should go down there, talk to somebody. Let them know they do not get to laugh like that. You do not fix fire with gasoline, Ruby said quietly. T.J. scoffed. Easy for you to say. You did not see the way that man talked to him. Ruby opened her eyes then. They were wet but steady.
Yes,
I saw it. And I saw Preston stand there and not break. That matters. TJ ran a hand over his face. What if this messes him up? What if they ruin him before he even gets started? Ruby looked toward the bedroom door where Preston slept. Then we stand between him and the noise. That is our job. At school the next day, the noise found him anyway. Whispers followed Preston down the hallway. Some kids stared openly. Others avoided him like he carried something contagious. Is that the kid from the video? My dad said he embarrassed himself. He thinks he is smarter than professors. Preston kept his eyes forward. In class, his teacher paused before calling his name. At lunch, no one sat next to him. Even the kids who had once asked him for help with homework now looked at him with something like caution. He did not cry, but the quiet felt different now, heavier, less safe. That afternoon, Preston sat on the floor of the public library, the same spot he always chose, back against the shelf marked Advanced Mathematics. He opened his notebook, pencil poised, then stopped. For the first time, the equations blurred, not because he did not understand them, because he felt alone with them. Across the city, in an office lined with awards, Richard Caldwell watched the same video replay on mute. He did not read the comments. He did not need to. The narrative was forming exactly as he expected. The boy would become a spectacle. The spectacle would burn itself out. The system would remain intact. Still, he found himself watching the clip again. the calm
I
voice,
think you may be in the
the
wrong place.
certainty, the absence of fear. Caldwell clicked the screen dark and leaned back in his chair. Outside his window, the campus lights glowed steadily, unchanged. Pressure did not arrive all at once. It never does. It arrived quietly, in sideways looks, in withheld invitations, in silence where curiosity used to be. And somewhere between a library floor and a professor's office, it began to build. By the third day, the laughter had thinned out. That was worse. Laughter burned fast and moved on. What replaced it settled in. Assumptions, labels, a version of Preston that strangers felt comfortable carrying around without ever meeting him. At Northwestern, the clip was no longer funny. It was inconvenient. Faculty emails circulated quietly, not about Preston directly, but about professionalism, about maintaining the integrity of academic spaces. Phrases like protecting the reputation of the competition and managing public perception appeared again and again. No one mentioned the child by name, but everyone knew who they meant. In the judge's lounge, conversation stopped when Dr. Patricia Whitmore entered the room. She could feel it in the way people avoided her eyes. "You really think there is something there?" one professor finally asked, voice low. "I think dismissing him without looking is dangerous," Whitmore replied. "Dangerous to whom?" another asked. Whitmore did not answer. At home, the pressure crept in through smaller cracks. Ruby noticed Preston stop talking about school. He ate quietly, slept lightly. When she asked him how his day was, he said fine in the same careful tone adults used when they did not want to explain themselves. One evening, she found him sitting on his bed, notebook open, staring at a single page without writing. "What is it, baby?" she asked, sitting beside him. Preston hesitated. "Grandma, do you think I said something bad?" Ruby's chest tightened. "Why would you think that? Because everyone is mad," he said. Not loud, not angry, just confused, like I broke something. Ruby took his hands in hers. They were cold. "You did not break anything," she said firmly. "You just said something people were not ready to hear." Preston nodded slowly. "But what if I am wrong?" Ruby did not answer right away. She chose her words the way she always did when truth mattered. Then you learn. But being wrong is not the same as being stupid. And it is not the same as being bad. Preston leaned against her shoulder. "It feels like they want me to disappear." Ruby closed her eyes. Sometimes when people cannot control something, they try to erase it. TJ overheard them from the hallway. That night, he slammed his phone down on the table. They are still talking about him. Some blog wrote that he should be banned from competing for making a mockery of real scholars. Ruby looked up sharply. "Where did you read that everywhere TJ said, 'You cannot protect him from this forever'?" "I am not trying to protect him forever," Ruby replied. "I am trying to protect him long enough." "Long enough for what?" "For the truth to catch up." TJ shook his head. "Truth does not win fights. People do." Ruby met his gaze. "Not always." The next morning, Preston walked back into Kresge Centennial Hall for orientation. This time, no one laughed. They watched, some with curiosity, some with irritation, some with something close to fear. A few students shifted their chairs away from him. One whispered something to another and glanced over quickly, as if Preston might hear through the air. He sat where he was told, hands folded, back straight. Inside, the pressure pressed harder now, not sharp enough to break him, just enough to test how much he could hold. Across the room, Caldwell noticed it too. The way people looked at the boy. The way the room adjusted around him. The system was reacting. Good, Caldwell thought. Let it. What he did not notice was how often his eyes drifted back to Preston, how the calm he had felt days earlier now required effort. That afternoon, Preston returned to the library again. Same floor, same shelf, same notebook. This time he wrote, not faster, not louder, just more carefully. He did not know what the next days would bring. He did not know how heavy the pressure would become, but he knew one thing. Whatever he had started, it was no longer just his, and the quiet weight pressing down on him was only the beginning. The announcement came quietly, too quietly, an email sent just after midnight to judges, organizers, and finalists. No press release, no discussion, just a single attachment and a brief line written in neutral administrative language. Final round adjustment. Please review. Dr. Richard Caldwell sat alone in his office when he pressed send. The lights were off except for the desk lamp, casting long shadows across framed diplomas and photographs of conference panels where he had once stood at the center, younger, sharper, unquestioned. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window, older now, but still in control. This was not cheating, he told himself. It was rigor. The finals were meant to test limits. And what limit could be more fitting than the most famous unsolved dispute in modern optimization theory, the Caldwell-Morrison problem? If the boy wanted attention, Caldwell would give him a stage. If the boy wanted to be taken seriously, Caldwell would let seriousness crush him. No one could solve it. That was the point. And when Preston failed, publicly and undeniably, the story would end exactly where it should have. A child who overreached, a system proven right. By morning, the news had already leaked. Someone on the organizing committee talked. Someone always did. The live stream registration numbers spiked overnight. Math forums lit up. Academic Twitter turned sharp and tribal. They changed the finals problem. Is that even allowed? This feels wrong. If the kid fails now, it proves nothing. If he succeeds, it changes everything. At breakfast, Ruby read the headline on her phone and felt her stomach drop. Final round to feature legendary Caldwell-Morrison debate. She looked up at Preston across the small kitchen table. "Baby," she said carefully. "They changed the problem." Preston nodded. "I know, Grandma." "You know he took a sip of milk?" Hands steady despite the dark circles under his eyes. "I thought they might." Ruby reached for his hand. "This is not fair." Preston did not answer right away. Fairness had never been part of his calculations. By the time they arrived at Kresge Centennial Hall, the building no longer felt academic. It felt theatrical. Cameras lined the walls. Tripods crowded the aisles. A digital countdown glowed on a screen near the stage, tracking live viewers climbing into the hundreds of thousands. Preston's name scrolled across social media alongside words like prodigy, fraud, miracle, mistake. TJ leaned close to him. "You do not have to do this, little man. Nobody would blame you." Preston looked at the stage, at the long table, at the empty chair waiting for him. "If I leave," he said quietly, "they will say they were right." On stage, Caldwell stood composed, hands folded, addressing the crowd with the practiced ease of someone used to authority. "This final round will test not answers, but thinking," he said. "No one is expected to resolve the problem fully." His eyes flicked toward Preston. "But claims have been made. And today, those claims will meet reality." A ripple of tension moved through the hall. Preston took his seat. The problem appeared on the screen behind them, dense and unforgiving. 32 years of debate condensed into a single impossible demand. The timer started, and the world watched. Minutes passed, then an hour. Teenagers around Preston scribbled furiously, crossed things out, stared at the ceiling, rubbed their temples. Some gave up early, knowing there was no shame in failing where generations had failed before. Preston wrote, then stopped. He flipped a page, wrote again, slower now. The noise outside the hall did not reach him, but the weight of it did. He could feel the expectation pressing down from every direction, the hope from strangers, the hunger for spectacle, the quiet desire to watch him fall. What if they were right, he thought. What if he had mistaken effort for insight? What if he had missed something obvious? What if all those nights on the library floor had led him here only to be proven foolish? His pencil hovered above the page. For the first time since he was 8 years old, the math did not feel like a refuge. It felt like a test he could fail. Across the room, Caldwell watched him closely. He saw the hesitation, the stillness. Good, he thought. The system was pushing back now. In the audience, Ruby gripped TJ's arm. He looks tired, she whispered. TJ swallowed hard. He is just a kid. On the live stream, the comments turned crueler. He is stuck. Told you he could not do it. This is painful to watch. Why would they put a child through this? Preston's chest tightened. His breathing grew shallow. Maybe I should stop, he thought. Maybe this is where I belong. At the edge, looking in. His pencil slipped from his fingers and rolled across the table. He stared at it as if it belonged to someone else. The timer continued to count down. And in that moment, surrounded by silence louder than any laughter, Preston Davis reached the lowest point of the journey he had never meant to begin. The system had closed in around him, and he was not sure he was strong enough to push back. The room did not move. It waited. That was the cruelty of it. Not the noise, not the cameras, not even the impossible problem glowing behind the stage. It was the waiting, the collective pause of thousands of people holding their breath, not out of hope, but anticipation. Preston sat perfectly still. His notebook lay open in front of him, pages filled halfway, then abandoned. The pencil rested where it had fallen, just out of reach. He could pick it up. He knew that. The distance was nothing, but it felt like miles. Inside his head, the numbers that had once flowed so easily now collided. Every path he followed led to doubt. Every assumption echoed with a voice that did not sound like his own. You do not belong here. You are too young. You misunderstood something basic. They were right to laugh. He glanced up just once. Across the room, students avoided his eyes. Some looked at him with pity, others with relief that it was not them under the microscope. A few looked away entirely, uncomfortable witnesses to a slow unraveling. Caldwell noticed the look. He leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together. To anyone watching, he appeared patient, generous even. A respected scholar allowing a child the space to learn a lesson. Inside, his thoughts were sharper. This is where it ends. This is where the myth collapses. This is where order is restored. He had not raised his voice, had not broken a rule, had simply let reality do the work. That was the beauty of systems. When they functioned properly, no one had to get their hands dirty. On the live stream, the tone shifted again. This feels wrong. Why is a 10-year-old being humiliated like this? They set him up. I cannot watch anymore. But others leaned in closer. This is what happens when confidence outruns ability. Reality check, hard lesson but necessary. Preston's hands trembled now. He clenched them together under the table, pressing his fingers into his palms until it hurt. He needed something solid, something real. For a moment, he considered standing up, not to present, not to argue, just to leave. He imagined walking back to the apartment with Ruby, sitting on the floor with his books again, returning to a world where mistakes were private and curiosity was safe. The thought almost broke him. In the audience, Ruby felt it before she saw it. A shift in her grandson's posture, the way his shoulders folded inward, as if he were trying to take up less space. She leaned forward instinctively. "Baby," she whispered, though there was no way he could hear her. "You do not have to be perfect." TJ's jaw was tight. "They are killing him up there." Ruby did not respond. Her eyes never left Preston. On stage, the timer ticked down. 30 minutes left. Preston finally reached for the pencil. His fingers closed around it, but the confidence did not return. He wrote one line, crossed it out, wrote another, stopped again. What if I was wrong from the beginning? What if I saw what I wanted to see? What if this was never about truth, just pride? A lump formed in his throat. For the first time since the day at registration, tears burned behind his eyes. He blinked hard, fighting them back. Crying would not help. Crying would prove something he did not want to prove. He stared at the page until the symbols blurred. This was not fear of failure anymore. It was something deeper. Fear that the world had been right about him all along. That he was a child who reached too far. A boy who mistook curiosity for destiny. A mistake the system was now correcting. Across the room, Caldwell glanced at the clock. Almost done. He felt no triumph, only relief. Soon, this would be over. The myth would collapse quietly. The headlines would move on. The system would remain clean, untouched. Preston lowered his head. The pencil slipped from his hand again, this time unnoticed. In that instant, surrounded by a hall built for certainty and a world hungry for resolution, Preston Davis reached the lowest point he had ever known. Not because he failed, but because, for the first time, he believed he might deserve to. The moment did not arrive with thunder. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does, slipping in when the noise finally exhausts itself. Preston stared at the page in front of him, eyes burning, chest tight. The proof he had trusted for years lay fractured beneath his gaze. Not broken, something worse. Incomplete. There it was, the gap. A thin space between two steps he had always moved across without hesitation. A transition he had accepted because it felt right. Because it had worked before, because no one had ever told him to question it. Now the space stared back at him, merciless. His throat closed. So this is it, he thought. This is where they were right. His hands trembled as he traced the line again with his finger, slower this time. He followed the logic backward, forward, sideways. Every path led back to the same place, the missing piece. The pressure in the room intensified as the clock continued its quiet march. Somewhere far away, someone coughed. A chair creaked. Preston barely noticed. He lowered his head, eyes closing for just a second. In the darkness behind his eyelids, memories surfaced, uninvited. The public library, the smell of old paper, a book too heavy for his arms slipping off the table when he was 8 years old. Why are they still arguing if they are both so smart? The question he had asked no one in particular. He opened his eyes, and suddenly, the gap looked different, not like a mistake, like a doorway. Preston's breath caught. His heart began to pound again, but this time, not with fear, with recognition. The problem was not that the step was missing. The problem was that everyone had assumed it did not exist. He leaned closer to the page, pencil shaking in his hand as his mind raced. Caldwell's framework, Morrison's objections, decades of papers circling the same assumption, arguing from opposite sides, never questioning the ground beneath their feet. They had both accepted the same boundary conditions, and that was the flaw. Not an error in logic, an error in perspective. There was a constraint neither side had named, a variable that did not belong to either camp because it lived outside the argument itself. Preston's pulse thundered in his ears. This is it. He flipped back through his notebook, pages rustling softly. His earlier work stared back at him, fragments of intuition he had never fully trusted, notes scribbled in the margins, questions he had circled and left unanswered. What if the system is not closed? What if the limit depends on what you refuse to measure? His pencil hit the page. This time, it did not hesitate. He rewrote the step, not patching it, but rebuilding it entirely. He introduced the missing constraint carefully, almost reverently, as if afraid it might disappear if he moved too fast. The math responded immediately. What had resisted him before began to fall into place. Lines aligned, relationships clarified. The proof did not fight back anymore. It opened. Across the room, Dr. Patricia Whitmore felt it before she understood it. She had been watching Preston since the hesitation began, trained eyes reading posture and pace the way others read equations. She had seen doubt before. She had seen collapse. This was neither. Preston was writing again, not frantically, not desperately, deliberately. Whitmore leaned forward in her seat, pen poised above her notepad. She followed his steps from memory, reconstructing what she could from the screen and the occasional camera cut to his page. And then she stopped breathing. That variable, her hand tightened around the pen. No one had ever framed it that way. Not Caldwell, not Morrison, not her, because it did not belong to either side. It belonged to someone who was never invested in winning the argument, only in answering the question. Whitmore felt a chill crawl up her spine. This is not luck, she thought. This is not bravado. This is someone who never learned which assumptions were sacred. On stage, Preston worked through the final transitions, sweat beading at his temples, his earlier fear now replaced by a fragile clarity he was terrified to lose. He could feel it, the way the proof held together now. The way it no longer needed him to force it forward. It stood on its own. The room remained silent, but something had shifted inside that silence. The clock ticked on, unnoticed. For the first time since he sat down, Preston Davis was no longer trying to survive the moment. He was ready to explain it. Preston sat back slightly, as if afraid that moving too fast might scare the idea away. The proof was there now. Not fragile, not patched together. Whole. He read it again from the beginning, forcing himself to slow down, to look for cracks the way the room would. Every step followed. Every assumption was named. Nothing hid behind reputation or tradition. It did not ask for permission. It simply worked. For the first time since the finals began, Preston felt something settle in his chest. Not relief. Something steadier. Understanding. He glanced up. Across the hall, the audience still looked the same. Faces frozen, bodies leaning forward, 100 different opinions suspended in midair. They had no idea what had just happened on that page. And that was okay. This part was not for them. Not yet. Dr. Patricia Whitmore had risen slightly from her seat without realizing it. She was no longer watching Preston. She was replaying the argument in her own mind, mapping his approach against 30 years of accepted thought. Caldwell's framework assumed a closed system. Morrison's rebuttal attacked that assumption from within. Both had missed the same thing. The boundary itself was conditional, not fixed, not absolute. Dependent on a constraint no one had bothered to isolate because doing so would have required stepping outside the debate entirely. Whitmore exhaled slowly. They were not wrong, she realized. They were trapped by their own positions, trapped by the need to defend them. This child had no such burden. He did not care who won, only what was true. On stage, Caldwell sensed the change before he understood it. Preston's posture was different now. The hesitation was gone. The tension in his shoulders had released, replaced by something Caldwell recognized instantly: certainty. A cold weight settled in his stomach. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing, trying to catch a glimpse of the boy's work when the camera cut briefly to the table. What he saw made his breath hitch. That term. It was not new, but the way it was being used was. No, that was not possible. Caldwell's fingers curled into the armrest of his chair. He told himself it was a coincidence, a misapplication, a child's misunderstanding dressed up as insight. But the longer Preston wrote, the more Caldwell felt something he had not felt in years: unease. Preston finished the final line and set his pencil down. He did not smile. He did not look at the crowd. He simply closed his notebook and waited. The silence that followed was different from the one before. This was not disbelief. It was recalculation. Whitmore stood. "Richard," she said, voice steady but unmistakably urgent, "I need to see his work." Caldwell looked at her sharply. "We will review everything after the presentations." Whitmore did not sit back down. "No, I need to see it now." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Caldwell hesitated for just a fraction of a second. That was all it took. A judge beside Whitmore leaned over, eyes wide. "If that variable is what I think it is." He did not finish the sentence. Preston watched them quietly, heart pounding again, but differently now. He was no longer afraid of being wrong. He was afraid of being right. Because right meant something else entirely. It meant the argument was over. It meant the hierarchy had been built on an incomplete map. It meant a 10-year-old boy had just stepped outside a system that had spent decades circling itself. On the live stream, the tone shifted without explanation. Why did everyone just stand up? Something happened. That professor looks shaken. Wait, is he actually right? The realization moved through the room in waves, uneven and unstoppable. This was not a clever trick, not a lucky guess, not a child repeating something he had memorized. This was an original mind identifying a blind spot that experience had made invisible. Whitmore finally spoke again, softer now. "This is not a prodigy moment," she said. "This is independent reasoning." She turned toward Preston. "You were not trying to win an argument, were you?" Preston shook his head. "No, Mom. I just wanted it to make sense." The words landed heavier than any equation. In that moment, something fundamental cracked open, not the debate itself, the way everyone had understood it. And as the room slowly absorbed what had just been revealed, one truth became impossible to ignore. The question had never been unsolvable. It had simply been waiting for someone who did not know which answers were supposed to be impossible. The stage lights felt hotter than before, not because they had changed, but because now the world was watching with purpose. The live stream counter climbed past numbers no one in that room had ever seen attached to a mathematics competition. Screens across universities, living rooms, newsrooms, and late-night offices showed the same image. A small black boy standing at the center of a hall built for giants. Preston Davis stepped forward when his name was called. He carried his notebook with both hands not because it was heavy, but because it mattered. The murmurs in the room faded as he reached the board. A staff member quietly placed a small platform beneath his feet so he could reach the chalk. Preston hesitated for a breath. Then he began. He did not perform. He did not sell. He explained. He walked them through the argument, as if guiding someone through a dark room he knew well. He named the assumptions first, both sides, Caldwell's boundary, Morrison's objection. He showed how each was internally consistent and why that consistency had kept them locked in place. Then he introduced the missing constraint. Slowly, carefully. The room followed. You could feel it happen the moment comprehension replaced resistance. Heads tilted, pens stopped moving. A few professors leaned back as if the air had been knocked from their lungs. This was not flashy mathematics. It was devastatingly simple once seen. When Preston reached the final line, he did not underline it. He did not emphasize it. He stepped back. That was all. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. Then someone stood. Then another. Dr. Patricia Whitmore was already on her feet. "The proof is sound," she said, her voice steady and unmistakable. "The debate is resolved." A gasp rippled through the hall, followed by something louder and more chaotic. Disbelief turning into recognition. The Caldwell-Morrison debate, 32 years old, cited in thousands of papers, argued in conference halls across continents, was over. Not amended, not delayed, finished. Caldwell stood slowly. He felt every eye in the room shift toward him. For a moment, he said nothing. His face was pale, unreadable, as if he were trying to locate himself in a story that no longer belonged to him. "From a mathematical standpoint," he said finally, his voice tight, "the lower bound holds." That was all he could say. It was true, and it was not enough, because truth had a second edge. The audience had not missed what came next. The questions whispered between rows, the headlines already forming, the context that no proof could erase. Caldwell had been right about the math, but profoundly wrong about the boy. He had tried to control the system and instead revealed himself inside it. The man who trusted hierarchy over curiosity would now be remembered forever alongside the child he tried to silence, not as mentor, not as gatekeeper, but as contrast. Cameras cut to his face, to Preston's, back and forth, history arranging its symmetry. Preston stepped down from the platform and walked toward Caldwell. The hall went silent again, not uneasy this time, expectant. Preston stopped a few feet away and looked up at him. "You were right about the problem, sir," he said, his voice clear but gentle. "But you were wrong about me." Caldwell swallowed. Preston held out his hand. "I forgive you." The words were not dramatic. They were not loud. They were devastating. A child offering grace where power had offered ridicule. Caldwell hesitated only a moment before taking the hand. His grip was unsteady. His eyes glistened despite his effort to remain composed. The cameras caught everything. The applause that followed was not polite. It was not academic. It was human. Ruby Davis pressed her hand to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. TJ shouted Preston's name without shame, without restraint. Across the world, people who had never cared about mathematics felt something break open inside them because they were not watching equations resolve. They were watching a system forced to look at itself. And in that moment, standing beneath lights that no longer belonged to him alone, Preston Davis had done more than solve a problem. He had exacted a price no one had expected, one that could never be repaid. The cameras left first, then the commentators, then the headlines moved on to the next. Outrage, the next miracle, the next argument waiting to be consumed. What remained was quiet. Preston Davis returned to the south side of Chicago on a regular city bus, his feet still not quite touching the floor. The trophy from Northwestern sat on the seat beside him for exactly 3 stops before Ruby made him put it in her tote bag. "You are going to drop that thing," she said. "And I am not explaining to the bus driver why my grandson lost history." Preston smiled, small and tired, leaning his head against the window as the city passed by. Brick buildings, corner stores, familiar streets that did not care what he had done or who had watched. At home, nothing had changed. The apartment was still small. The fridge still hummed too loudly. Ruby still complained about her knees. TJ still argued with the TV during basketball games. And Preston was still 10 years old. The next morning, he walked to the public library the way he always had. The librarian nodded at him without surprise. The same table waited. The same shelves leaned quietly under the weight of too many books. He sat on the floor, back against the shelf marked Advanced Mathematics, and opened a new notebook. No one applauded. No one questioned him. That was the point. He worked for hours, pencil moving steadily, not chasing legacy or recognition, just answers. just the quiet satisfaction of something finally making sense. Across the country, the academic world recalibrated. Papers were rewritten, lectures adjusted. A footnote became a footnote no longer. The proof would eventually be named after Preston, not because he asked for it, because history had no other honest choice. Dr. Richard Caldwell resigned from the competition committee within the month. He kept his title, his office, his career. But something had shifted permanently. In every introduction, every biography, every discussion of his life's work, there would be an asterisk that did not appear on paper. The moment he laughed, the moment he underestimated, the moment the system revealed itself through him. He had been right about the math, and wrong about almost everything else. Preston never spoke publicly about forgiveness again. When asked, he shrugged and said his grandma taught him that holding on to anger made it harder to think clearly. Ruby Davis watched her grandson closely in the weeks that followed. She noticed the way he slept more soundly, the way he asked more questions than he answered, the way he still forgot to take out the trash unless reminded twice. "You still my baby," she told him one night as she tucked him in. Preston grinned. "I know, Grandma." Somewhere, another child sat in a broken classroom with a book that did not belong there. Another kid learned early what it felt like to be dismissed before being heard. That child would hear this story someday, not as a fairy tale, not as inspiration dressed up as comfort, but as proof. Proof that justice does not arrive to punish villains. It arrives to expose assumptions, to strip away certainty, to force the powerful to confront what they decided not to see. And when the noise finally fades, when the arguments collapse under their own weight, what remains is not agreement. It is clarity. The silence didn't mean they agreed. It meant the truth had finally arrived.